Well, hello and welcome to the program today, Increasing Productivity and Profitability Through Clear Communication with Dr. Patty Malone. Dr. Patty Malone is a leading authority in communication. She has a PhD in organizational communication and is a professor at Cal State Fullerton, my alma mater. Thank you, Patty. And she also teaches at UC Irvine. She has more than 25 years experience in the field of communication in the following areas. She's been a corporate trainer, including for the well-known company Dale Carnegie. She's a speaker, author, professor, and has been a TV news anchor. She currently owns her own business, Clear Communication Institute, and she helps companies increase productivity and profitability through communicating clearly. She specifically focuses on communication in organizations and has spent many years conducting research into costly communication mistakes in companies, including backstabbing, envy in the workplace, conflict, and the importance of clear communication. Today, Patty will focus on increasing productivity and profitability through clear communication, how to communicate clearly to improve relationships with your colleagues and customers, and positively impact your bottom line. If you are ready to improve your communication in the workplace, here is Dr. Patty Malone. Thank you, Patty. Welcome.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome everybody. I know you believe you understand what you think I said. What I'm not sure you realize is what you heard is not what I meant. Does that sound familiar? Have you ever felt misunderstood? Do you and your team members sometimes have trouble understanding each other? Is your company wasting time and money due to miscommunication and misunderstanding? You're not alone. NASA ended up spending $300 million too much on the Mars probe because one team measured in inches and the other in centimeters. In addition to that, recent research indicates companies waste $37 billion a year due to miscommunication. 89% of those companies reported reduced productivity the previous year due to miscommunication. 70% of all organizational change efforts failed due to miscommunication, and 400 of those companies said they placed their own people or the public at risk of physical injury due to miscommunication. Of course, we've all heard the stories of plane crashes killing hundreds of people, where the cause was directly attributed to miscommunication between the air traffic control tower and the pilot. So besides costing a fortune, killing people, and placing others at risk, what is the impact of all this miscommunication? We see it every day in the workplace. And my slide is not forwarding. It's not forwarding. There we go. So the impact that we see, we actually see it every day in the workplace. We see it in terms of damaged relationships, increased conflict, worsening morale, dissatisfied customers, difficult relationships with coworkers, unhappy employees, decreased job satisfaction, decreased productivity, and turnover. All of this impacts the bottom line. Now, how do we prevent all this from happening? By being prepared ahead of time and knowing what to do. Today, we're going to talk about the 3 most costly communication mistakes, when they are most likely to occur, and what we can do about them. Not forwarding again. But before we jump into all that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I know about this, why I care about this topic, why I'm passionate about it. So where did that slide go?
Patty, I'll go ahead and control the slides for you.
Okay, can we back up? Sorry, we're having some technical difficulties here. Everything worked fine earlier. Okay, so I got into TV news when I graduated from college with the idea of becoming a TV news anchor. But one of the first things that I saw was an opening occurred for an on-air position. I was just brand new. I wasn't applying for it. But 2 other people were competing against each other for that particular job that worked within the station. One of them took the microphone when the other one was going out on an audition and sabotaged it. So when the other person came back, there was no audio. I saw that and I was really horrified. I thought, why would people resort to that kind of behavior instead of just relying on their own talents and their own skills? Well, as I continued on in TV, I did become an anchor and I worked in TV for 10 years. And I saw a lot more of that type of behavior. But I also saw really good behavior. I actually worked in the very best of circumstances as well as the very worst of circumstances. So I learned what really worked in terms of good communication and what did not work in terms of poor communication. But after 10 years as a TV news anchor, I decided that I wanted to go into corporate America because I would never have to deal with that type of competitive behavior again, right? Well, I was in for a rude awakening. I went to work for a major aerospace firm, and I worked for two departments, public affairs and video production. I was in charge of producing and anchoring a corporate newscast that was sent out to divisions around the country. But first, I had to get the approval of both of the department chairs. Well, little did I know when I was hired, these two had a 10-year ongoing conflict going on, and they either would not communicate with each other at all, or they were out to get each other. And I was constantly caught in between this. One of them would approve the newscast, and then the other one would say no because the first one said yes. So I would make changes to make that one happy, and then the other one would say no because now this one was saying yes. So as this would continue on, I thought, oh my gosh, this company is wasting so much time and it's costing them thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars because they're not dealing with this. They're not communicating and they're not talking to each other. So I only stayed there 1 year because that was a really toxic environment, but it was enough to spark my interest in deciding to go back to school to study these things and find out why people either don't communicate or why they have such dysfunctional communication between them. So that's why I went back to grad school. And I went back with the idea of becoming a professor so that I could teach our up and coming future leaders of corporate America how to be better leaders and how to communicate before they got to corporate America, as well as to go back into corporate America as a professional speaker and a corporate trainer to help them prevent these communication mistakes, as well as to correct the ones that have already occurred. So now let's go on ahead and move into our first costly communication mistake. So what do you think is the most costly communication mistake? And before we do that, there's a couple of things I want to keep in mind as we are going through this. We want to open up our minds a bit and shift our perspective. Instead of looking at things the way we always have, we want to open up our minds a bit and consider somebody else's perspective. So everybody, just look at your screen for a minute and fold your hands together, cross your fingers together. Okay, now do it the other way. Did it feel a little awkward, just a little bit uncomfortable because we're not used to doing it that way? Okay, now the next thing is cross your arms. You may not be able to see me do it, but cross your arms in front of your chest. And now do it the other way. Can you even do it? Oftentimes we find we can't even do that because it's outside of our comfort zone and it's not what we're used to doing. So instead, what we want to do is we want to start thinking about seeing things in a different way. Another thing that comes up is, you know how we can always see other people's issues, but not our own? So for example, right now, you can see my eyebrows and I can't see them. If I turned my head around, you could see the back of my head, but I can't see the back of my head unless I look in a mirror. Well, that's how we are with our own blind spots. We just can't see everything about ourselves. It's always like, oh, what's wrong with that person? They keep doing the same thing over and over again. And the last piece of this is we have a way of seeing things through our own perspectives, our own lenses. And we have a way of tending to think that our own lenses are more right, more correct, or better than somebody else's. So what we want to do instead is take those lenses off, maybe unconceal some of our own blind spots as we go through this. Okay, so now let's get into our costly communication mistakes. What do you think the first one is? Now just think about that for a second. The first biggest one is not listening. Have you ever been in a conversation with somebody at work and you just felt they weren't listening to you? Yes, we all have. And why do you think you felt that way? And you may think about things like, well, they were looking at their phone, or they weren't making eye contact, or they were multitasking, doing something else. And that's all true. But the bottom line, the main reason you felt that they weren't listening to you is because they weren't. We don't listen to people. We don't listen 75% of the time. So what are we doing instead? Why are we not listening? Well, what we're doing instead is we're tuning out. We're either thinking about things like, what do I want for dinner? Or what do I need to get done tomorrow? But we're really good at pretending. We've become masters. We smile, we nod our heads, we give the nonverbals, but we're actually off in la la land thinking about something else. Either that or we're waiting. They say something and we think about it and we want to just jump right in with our 2 cents or to rebut what they just said. And as the minute we do that, we're no longer listening. We're out of the conversation. Now, why do we do this? We do it for a couple of reasons. One, we may be bored. We may have no interest in the topic that they're talking about, or we may not understand. Maybe they're talking over our heads. It's too complex and we're not following. Unfortunately, in the workplace, a lot of times when somebody's maybe explaining something new to us, and maybe it is a little complex and hard to follow, the time when we should most be listening is when we start drifting off because we don't understand what they're saying. And another issue that comes up, and this is a big one, is, oh, I already know that. I've heard this before. I've heard it a million times. I already know that. But we really miss out on a lot when we start thinking like that. And I'll give you an example. I go to a lot of entrepreneur workshops and businessing functions and conventions, etc. And at every one of these, for a number of years, I always heard one particular topic come up over and over. So I was completely tuned out from it. Every time that topic would come up, I would say to myself, I already know that. I've heard this a million times before. Well, one time, after doing that for a number of years, somebody started talking about that topic again. And I thought, I really should be listening. I should stop drifting off. So I started really listening to what they were saying. And I somehow heard it in a slightly different way than I'd heard it before. The examples were a little bit different. And it really meant something different to me. So I actually took that information home and applied it to my own business. And it made a huge impact. So we don't want to just shut down because, oh, I already know that, or I've heard this before. If you really listen, you'd be surprised what you might pick up. Now, what about people who shout? People who start like raising their voices, talking over top of each other, yelling, shouting. Why do you think they do that? They actually do it because they don't feel like they're being heard. And they're going to force you to hear them. So they start talking over you. They start yelling. They start shouting. So they're going to force you to listen to them. And also, what about those people who ramble? They keep rambling on and on. They corner you. You can't get away from them. They're not saying anything of any interest or importance to you. Blah, 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 blah. Won't stop talking. That's another thing. That they do it for the same reason. It's kind of a vicious cycle. They start talking because they want to force you to listen because they know that you're not listening. And the more they talk, the more you don't listen. And the more you don't listen, the more they talk. It's like a never-ending vicious cycle with that. And let me give you an example about possibly how to deal with this. I used to work with somebody like that a number of years ago, and it was somebody that everybody honestly avoided. They saw her coming and they would go in the opposite direction because they knew they were going to get trapped and didn't want to get caught. Well, this one particular day, I'm walking down the hall and I see her coming in my direction. And I kind of panicked. I thought, oh no, what am I going to do? Here she comes. So I dove into my office, but she followed me in. She came in behind me and I was trapped. She was blocking my exit. So I'm going crazy in my head. It's like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get her out of here? How am I going to get away from her? So as I was doing that and she's talking, I started thinking about it. I thought, this doesn't make any sense. I'm studying communication and I can't even deal with somebody who talks too much. There's got to be a better way than running off and escaping. So I actually started really listening to her. Like really listening, like understanding why she felt the way she did, who she was as a person, where she was coming from as a human being. And I kept really listening. She talked for 5 minutes, kept going. Another 10 minutes, she was still going. About 15 minutes in, she finally started running out of steam. And she realized, perhaps for the first time, that somebody was actually listening to her. Now, after that, whenever we interacted after I did that, she never did that to me again. She still did it to other people, but she didn't do it to me. The point being, we can make a slight shift in how we communicate and we can transform our relationships. We can't change the other person, but we can totally change how we interact with them and how we respond to them. Now, another situation that comes up when we really tend to not listen is if we're judging somebody. If we're thinking things to ourselves like, oh, what's she talking about? That's a stupid idea, or this is not the sharpest tool in the shed, or she's kind of a buffoon. Those types of thoughts, we're not too likely to listen. In fact, this situation kind of reminds me of the lyrics to that old Aerosmith song, Dream On. Learn from fools and from sages. But we tend to only think we can or only want to learn from sages. Or we think if we are learning from fools, it's only what not to do. But it's not true. You would be amazed at what can happen when you start really listening to everybody. So an example of this, when I was in my master's program, I was in a library surrounded by books and notebooks. And there was a girl that was in several of my graduate classes that honestly, nobody had any respect for her. We all thought she was kind of a buffoon, never had anything intelligent to contribute to any of the conversations or discussions. And I see her approaching me. So as I'm sitting there, I thought, oh my gosh, here she comes. And I'm trapped. I've got all these books and notebooks. So she walks up to me and she says, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm really busy because I'm going to get this master's degree in 1 year. In other words, I'm too busy to talk to you. So go away, leave me alone, and don't bug me. And she looked down at me and she said, well, I think you're crazy. And I said, what? And she said, yes, I think that you should take 2 years to get your master's, write a thesis, get straight A's, and you will have your choice of the top 5 PhD programs in the country. And then she turned around and left. And I sat there for a minute, really pretty stunned. I thought, why am I doing this in 1 year? There's no reason that I have to. It's just that fast track thing we so often do. Let's just get through this. And I slept on it and I thought, you know what? I think that's actually a really good idea. So I changed my program. I spent the 2 years, I wrote the thesis, I got my straight A's, which I probably would not have been able to do if I tried to jam everything into 1 year. And I did get my choice of the top PhD communication programs in the country. And because I came from a top school, I was able to get the job that I wanted here. And also that opened the door for me to start my own business as a communication consultant and professional speaker, etc. And honestly, I don't know what would have happened if I had not done that, if I had not taken her advice. So it was literally a life-altering, life-changing decision I made based on advice I took from someone I had no respect for. So we just never know what the impact's going to be if we really start listening to somebody. So I have a challenge for you over the next week. Start to really consciously listen and notice when you're drifting off, when you're not paying attention. It's really shocking when you first start doing this. I was stunned when I first started paying attention as to how often I was drifting away and not listening to somebody else. Well, we don't want to be part of that 75% who's not listening. So what we want to do instead is when we catch ourselves, the awareness is the first step. So awareness, we can catch ourselves. Then we can bring ourselves back to the conversation, get out of our heads, consciously shift our attention over there to the other person, be present in that conversation, focus on what they're saying, and re-engage with them. And one good way to do that is to start asking questions. So that's my challenge for you over the next week, and see what happens. See how that starts shifting your communication and your relationships. All right, communication mistake number 2. We don't show appreciation, and you've probably heard this before. People will leave people. They will leave a bad manager, a toxic environment. They're not leaving their jobs. A poll of 1 million workers by Gallup indicated the top reason they left their job was because they were not getting any appreciation or recognition. 70% of US Americans say that they do not receive any kind of appreciation or praise on the job. So people will take a new job for more money, but they will leave one to get more recognition and appreciation. So what do we need to do? First of all, we need to include others. Now, one of the reasons people feel that they aren't receiving appreciation is because they don't feel they're being heard, the first issue that we talked about. Another part of that is including others in the decision-making process. A lot of times people don't feel heard because they will make a contribution or try to make a contribution to the decision-making process, and it will be ignored. So let me give you a couple of examples. I was training a company a couple of years ago, and I was actually listening into a sales team call. They were scattered around the country, and I was literally like a fly on the wall. They did not know I was listening in, but the idea was for me to help pinpoint where the communication breakdowns and issues were. So as I'm listening to this conversation, this one woman had this idea to help increase sales for her team. So she started talking about it. She talked for maybe, I don't know, a minute and a half, 2 minutes. And then the sales manager interrupts her and he says, "That's not going to happen." Dead silence, you could hear a pin drop. I was really stunned. I thought a few things. First of all, I thought, oh my gosh, if that's how he talks to her, she's going to stop contributing, stop suggesting ideas, withdraw, and probably even leave her job. The second thing I thought was, if he's talking to her like that, you know he's talking to the rest of the team members like that too. So it was a really bad situation. There's a number of ways he could have handled that, any of which would have been better than what he did. Maybe ask her where she got the idea, or say that merits further discussion. Let's set up a one-on-one and talk about it further. In which case, then he could have explained to her why he did not think that was going to work. Maybe they tried something similar before and it just didn't pan out. But she had no idea why. He completely cut her off. Plus, he made her lose face, feel embarrassed in front of her peers. It was a really bad situation. So people need to know why something does or doesn't happen. Well, we instilled some communication systems in there. A lot of the people didn't even realize they were doing that. Their managers had this idea of, well, we don't need to praise people, they get a paycheck. They really didn't understand the damage that was creating. So after we went in there and we installed some communication systems to get them communicating within and across teams, things improved really greatly for the better. Another thing is, if somebody doesn't get a raise or promotion they were expecting, again, they need to know why, or they'll never improve. And plus, they will be resentful, they will be withdrawn, they will be angry about it. So there's one more example I want to give you about including others in the decision maker. This is actually when I was an undergraduate. When I was working my way through college, I was an undercover store detective arresting shoplifters. Well, once a month, we would have this security meeting. It was for a large department store like Macy's. It was a chain like that. And there were 10 of us who did that. Well, this one particular meeting, one of the higher ups who had never done our job and didn't really know anything about how we operated, came in and announced that instead of having us always be undercover, they were going to put us in bright red jackets with the word security emblazoned across the front. Now, they didn't ask us for any feedback or what we thought about that idea. And if they had, we might have been able to make it work. We would have said, split us in half, keep half of us undercover, and we'll continue to arrest shoplifters, and then put the other half in the red jackets as a preventative measure. But they didn't. Instead, what they did was 1 week we were in red jackets with security emblazoned across. The next week we were undercover. The next week we were back in the red jackets with security. The next week we were back undercover. Well, what do you think happened? The shoplifters figured out pretty quickly who we were. So all they did was wait until we weren't in the store. So they just did not shoplift in front of us. Shoplifting did not go down, but the security team did. Half of us left, including me, because the job was just too difficult and frustrating and it wasn't fun anymore. So that's why it's really important to include the people who are doing the jobs in the decision-making process as much as possible. We need to make sure that we're showing appreciation and recognition. And a lot of times we think, well, that's up to somebody, way up at the top, and they'll set the bar high and it will trickle down. That's great in an ideal world, but that's not the way it always works out. The bottom line is, it doesn't matter what level you are in the organization. Wherever you are, you can start doing it. What we need to do is speak from our hearts and be authentic and give praise, recognition, and appreciation to each other. We can do it to our peers, we can do it to our supervisors, we can do it to our subordinates. We don't need to wait for somebody else to do it. Just simple things like, that was a great job of calming that irate customer this morning. Or, I'm so excited to have you on my team. or I'm so excited to be on your team. But just simple little things like that, the attaboys, the pat on the back, that we can give to each other. And that can trickle up. Instead of waiting for things to trickle down, that can start on more of a ground level, and that can trickle up, and it can impact everybody. Okay, before we go into the mistake number 3, let's take a little breather and see if anybody has any questions at this point. Lisa, do you see any questions coming in?
Let me see. We've got nothing in the Q&A yet, but I have a question for you, Patty.
Okay.
I want to go back to the person that cornered you in your office, and when you shifted attention onto her so that she felt heard. How do you do that if there's more than one person in a meeting, and you feel like there's a lot of crosstalk and just generally everybody's trying to jockey for position in a meeting?
Okay, that's a great question. And I do want to mention briefly, that's going to be one of our upcoming webinars that will be coming up soon. It specifically focuses on that, but there's actually several ways to deal with that. A quick way to respond to that is if you develop some guidelines for the most effective meetings and do it together as a group where everybody's on board with it, you can lay down some basic guidelines that can help prevent everybody talking at once, and where you can even pass like a baton or something like that, and whoever's got the baton, it's their turn to talk. And you can make it like a fun thing. Sometimes you can even, if somebody's speaking out of turn, throw a rubber chicken at them and just make it fun. It lightens things up. That's one thing that you can do. Another thing that you can do is create more of a round robin where you actually go around and ask each person what their opinion is about the current topic or about something controversial that was just brought up, to give everybody an equal chance, and even say, you've got 1 minute. Let's hear what you've got to say about this particular thing. So those are just a couple of quick ideas, but I do know exactly what you're talking about, and there's a number of effective ways to deal with that we'll go into in detail very soon.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I don't see anything else come through. Feel free, you guys, to ask questions in chat or in Q&A, and the next time Dr. Malone pauses to make sure everybody has their questions answered, we'll get back to that for sure. All right, Dr. Malone.
Okay, so let's go to costly communication mistake number 3. Misperceptions. We give and receive conflicting messages, mixed signals, and then things come out into a big garbled mess, and we don't know why. And we do this both verbally and non-verbally. So let's start by talking about non-verbally. First of all, what do we mean by non-verbal communication? Well, typically we mean things like facial expressions, gestures that we make, hand gestures, body language. Are we leaning forward? Are we leaning back? Are we crossing our arms? What kinds of signals are we giving? That also includes things like how close we're standing to somebody, what kind of eye contact we're making, handshakes, the way we're dressed. So there are a lot of things that fall under nonverbals. So with the nonverbals, I'm going to give you a few scenarios. This is a quick little activity that we are going to do. I'm going to give you a few scenarios, and I want you to think about, if you were in that situation, how would you interpret that? What would you mean? What would that mean to you? And you can go ahead and respond in the chat box so Lisa can see it and can let me know some of the things that you're saying. Okay, so there's going to be 3 different scenarios. You don't need to write like a whole paragraph, but just maybe a sentence, how you would interpret this, how you would feel if you were on the receiving end of this. So the first situation is you're meeting with a colleague, you're in their office, and they keep looking at their watch or a clock the entire time that you're there. How would you interpret that? What do you think that would mean?
All right, Dr. Malone, we have that the person that you would think that they have other important things to do, that maybe you're not important to them, or that they're bored.
Okay.
Or they have somewhere else that they like to be.
Okay, great.
Linda says that she would feel rushed and like the person isn't listening to her. That happens to me.
Yes.
That they're more concerned about their time and not concerned about me. Great one.
Okay, great. Good. All right, now for the second scenario, Say that you have an office, maybe it's a Christmas party, something that's a little bit dressier, maybe around Christmas party, and people are wearing cocktail attire and everybody's there. And then suddenly one of your colleagues comes in, but they're wearing shorts and flip-flops. How would you interpret that?
Okay, there are a couple things coming into the chat. They did not get the memo about the dress code, apparently.
I hear that a lot.
That there's a miscommunication on the invitation.
Okay.
That they misunderstood the expectations, or that they're there, they want to have fun.
Okay.
I would think that they didn't have any sense of what was appropriate for business.
Okay. Yeah, and sometimes people will say things like they're trying to make a statement or they're being disrespectful or they don't care, something along those lines, but all of those are valid.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now this third situation, you are meeting with a colleague, a member of the opposite sex, and they keep staring intently at your chest.
Let's see. Well, text. I would feel uncomfortable.
Of course.
Yeah, that's. Someone says, "Hey, my eyes are up here." That person is insecure if they're staring at the opposite sex's chest. I would think that I spilled something on my shirt.
Okay. Yeah.
Do I have a stain on my shirt? That's a common one.
Yes.
Maybe the person is an introvert and doesn't like eye contact. That's a really good one.
Yeah, that is a good one. A lot of times, especially if it's women thinking about men, it's like, oh, what a creep, what a creepy crawler, pervert, something like that. Okay, and now what about when you're talking to somebody and the whole time you're talking to somebody, they're sitting like this with their arms crossed and they're kind of leaning back like this? How would you take that? What does that mean?
Let's see. Takes just a second for it to catch up.
Okay.
That they're closed, not wanting to hear what the other person is saying. They can just be taking it all in. So that's both perspectives.
Okay.
Another person says that they're not interested or they don't really care. They look down upon what you're saying. They don't want to listen. Great feedback, everybody. Thank you. They're preparing for the worst. They're in a defensive position, or maybe they're analyzing what I said, or they don't agree, or they're cold. In offices, that can be true sometimes.
Absolutely. And that's actually exactly where we're going with this. A lot of times what happens with nonverbals is we tend to go to the stereotypical things that we've been taught for interpretations, and they're usually negative, and they're not always correct either. So usually if I'm talking about this, if I'm in a group and I've got an audience, there's always a few people that are sitting there like that. And I'll typically ask a couple of them, why are you sitting like that? And they'll either say, because it's comfortable. I'm just comfortable sitting like this, or because I'm cold. I know I do that a lot when I'm cold, but it doesn't automatically mean that somebody's hostile, defensive, guarded, they don't care about you, they're not interested in what you're saying. But that's just where our head goes. So let's go back to those other scenarios. The first one, where somebody's constantly looking at a watch or their clock, there could be some other explanations for that. Maybe they've got somebody in the hospital. Maybe somebody's about to have a baby and they're waiting to hear news of it. Or maybe they've got somebody that's having surgery. Or maybe there's some urgent thing going on in their personal life or family life that we don't know about. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not interested in you or they're trying to get you out of there, or that, what you have to say is not important. It doesn't necessarily mean that. And then the second one, the situation where somebody comes highly underdressed for a office function, maybe they had like a car issue. They were doing something else and they had a flat tire, they had some kind of a car problem, and by the time they got it together, they decided that it might be more important just go straight there rather than, especially in Southern California, right, driving all the way home and then maybe commuting way in some other direction, that they thought it might just be more important to do that instead. Not necessarily that they were disrespectful or that they didn't get the memo or that they didn't know what it meant. And then that third one, You're sitting there talking to a member of the opposite sex and they're staring intently at your chest. Well, this actually happened, and it was a woman who was talking, and a man that she was talking to was staring intently at her chest. She had a wasp crawling across her chest. That's what he was staring at. It was not any of the other weird interpretations that we automatically jump to. Or it could be like what somebody else said. Maybe they spilled something, or sometimes somebody's wearing a shirt that's got a picture or something on it, or writing, and maybe somebody's trying to read it. I think somebody else mentioned like not really knowing where your eyes are, not necessarily spacing out, maybe introverted, but maybe thinking about formulating a response to something and not really paying attention to where their eyes are. It doesn't necessarily mean that they've got the hots for you or that they're being creepy about something. So we need to just keep that in mind, because nonverbals are really ambiguous. They're very complex, and we don't always know what they mean. Now, the next thing is, what about when our nonverbals are inconsistent with what we're saying? So have you ever been in a situation, and I'm sure all of us have at some point, where we're talking to somebody, and honestly, this is more likely to be like a significant other rather than in a business situation, but we get the sense that something isn't quite right. And we say, "What's wrong?" And they say, "Nothing." Do we believe that? No. In fact, when our nonverbals don't match what we're saying, 55% of what we believe is based upon facial expression and body language. 38% is based upon tone of voice, how we say something, and only 7% is based on the actual content of what we're saying. So that's why it is really important that we remain consistent, that our body language, our facial expressions match what we say. Otherwise, it's really confusing, and people aren't going to know what to do. So let me give you an example. We're going to do a little experiment here. So again, if you can look up at me, I'm going to give you some instructions, and just, I know you're home probably by yourself or in front of the computer in the office, but just go ahead and follow these instructions. This will be less than a minute. It goes really quick. Okay, so everybody make a fist, make the peace sign, make the okay sign. Okay, now close your eyes. This will only be for 3 seconds. I promise. I'll count out loud and you count to yourself. Close your eyes. If you can still see me, your eyes are open. 1, 2, 3. Open your eyes. Make the fist again. Make the okay sign. Put it on your chin. Okay. How many of you actually put it on your chin? How many put it on your cheek? How many of you didn't know where to put it? Couldn't make up your mind. The point is, most of you did not put it on the cheek. I mean, did put it on the cheek, because I did. Most of you did not put it on the chin. I said put it on the chin, but I did put it on my cheek. In most cases, people will follow what you do. So you were probably one of those. 90% of you probably did that. So that's another example of why we want to make sure we're consistent, because people are going to follow what we do, not what we say. So we want to make sure that we are matching the nonverbal to the verbal, and that we don't just automatically jump to conclusions about meanings. Now, not only do we do this non-verbally, but we also do it verbally. Have you ever explained something to someone, thought they understood, and you walk away, you think, I'm done, I communicated this, I explained it, they got it, they didn't get it at all. But you don't even realize it until they're not performing their job correctly and things are falling apart. So we want to make sure that we don't do that. Can I see the next, Lisa? Okay, great. So what we want to do is we want to check understanding. And the best way to do that is to ask questions, because we don't always understand what somebody else says. And sometimes they don't understand what we say, especially if, as we mentioned earlier, if somebody's explaining something complex, they may start drifting and they may not be listening when they most need to be. So let's look first if we are at the receiving end. How many times has somebody explained something to you? We're like, we think we've got it. They walk away. We start doing it, and then we're like, oh my gosh, what did they say we were supposed to do next? So if we're on the receiving end, To make sure that we're understanding the entire equation of the communication, we need to ask questions. Would you mind repeating that third step again? I want to make sure I got it down. Or if we're on the giving end, if we're the ones is giving the explanation and the instructions, a lot of times the other person won't ask questions. They may be shy, they may feel like they're going to sound stupid, or they should already know that. So if they're not asking questions, we need to ask them questions to make sure they actually understood the message the way that we intended for them to do. The key is just don't do it in a way that puts them on the defensive. Don't say, hey, repeat back to me what I just said. Just ask with a smile on your face. Would you mind explaining that from your perspective? I just want to make sure that we're on the same page, and say it with a smile. And just ask a couple of questions just to make sure that they are getting it so that they won't be lost. And as long as they feel that you're on their side, it won't be a problem. So we want to be completely responsible for both sides of the acute communication equation, whether we're the sender or the receiver. That's the only way we're going to know if the message was actually understood the way that it was intended. Now, another thing that we want to keep in mind is we want to avoid really complex or ambiguous terms. Now, it's kind of funny with the ambiguous terms. A lot of times we take everyday words for granted. I'm not even talking about complicated words at this point. We might say something like, I'm going to be a few minutes late. What does that mean? To some people, that might mean 3 to 5 minutes. To some, it might mean 10 to 20. To others, it might mean an hour. So we need to be on the same page with that. What do we mean? Is it 5 minutes or is it 35 minutes? So we need to ask and check to make sure that we're understanding that. But there's a lot of words like that we take for granted, and we just assume the other person knows what we mean when they don't. Another thing we want to do is avoid the complex language. If we lose people, they're confused, if we're using technical jargon, or a lot of times we're just using jargon maybe from our own industry where we all understand it, but then we're talking to a layperson or somebody who's not in our department and they don't know what we're talking about. So I want to give you an example of a disastrous situation of using complex language, because you really need to get on the same level as your audience, whether it's one-on-one or an audience of 1,000. I was attending a business conference, and there was a panel of angel investors, and they were listening to several people present business ideas, and they were looking to invest a lot of money in these business ideas. Plus, there was a $10,000 prize for the best business idea. Well, this one man got up and started talking. He was very excited about his idea. So I was instantly engaged because he was so excited, I was. But about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes in, I realized I had no idea what he was talking about. Right at that moment, one of the angel investors said, "Sir, I'm going to have to stop you right there." And he turned to the audience of 400 people and said, "How many of you understand what he's talking about?" 2 people raised their hands out of 400 people. So nobody had a clue what he was talking about. Well, at that point, he could forget about getting any money from any of the angel investors or winning any kind of a contest. So that was a very costly mistake for him. All right, so now let's think about, when are these mistakes most likely to occur? What are the danger zones for miscommunication? The first one is anytime there's any kind of an organizational change, and it could be something simple. Maybe a new manager comes into a department, or maybe there's a slight technology change, or it could be something major. Maybe there's a big merger or there's downsizing. But anytime there's an organizational change, that creates a climate of fear, uncertainty. What's going to happen to my job? Am I still going to have a job? And that's when all kinds of miscommunication, misperception, and misunderstanding can occur. So that's a very dangerous time. Things need to be communicated very clearly at the right times and to the right people to prevent that from happening. And that can make the difference between people being on board with the change and backing it up, or totally resisting it. Another time when there's a lot of miscommunication is if you're dealing with conflict. If you have some people that are involved in a conflict, it typically starts to spread, other people get involved. That could create a toxic environment. Or if you've got difficult people, you may just have one difficult person on a team, but one difficult person left unchecked without nipping it in the bud can poison the entire team. It can create a very toxic environment. It can spread like wildfire. through a department. So if you've got either conflict or difficult people, again, that is totally creating the environment where a lot of miscommunication and communication breakdowns can occur. Also with team building, whenever your team changes dynamics at all, maybe you bring in a new member, maybe you're expanding, maybe you're hiring new people, you're a growing company, you're forming new teams. Again, that's going to create that environment of uncertainty where people don't know what is going on, or they may not be communicating well across teams. A lot of potential for miscommunication and communication breakdowns. Also with business presentations, like that example I just gave you, like he could have used some coaching, some help with how to speak in the language that everybody can understand. And that happens a lot. People start talking like in real financial or numbers, technical terms, or IT technical terms, and other people just don't have any idea what they're talking about. And then the big one, this is so big, especially today, communication across teams or silos when everybody's into their own thing and there's complete breakdowns across teams. Departments, all levels and generations, cultural, anytime you're communicating across anything, that creates a great potential. And I want to give you an example of this across teams. There was another company I was training last year, and they had some major breakdowns across teams. One team would make a change or decision within that team, but it impacted all the other teams, and they did not communicate it to them. So the sales team finds out about this change from a customer outside of the company, and he was really embarrassed. He felt like he looked stupid. He should have known about it, and the client tells him about this change. Another group found out about it when they submitted a project the same way they'd been doing for years, and they hear, oh, we're not accepting these anymore. What? Well, when were you going to tell us about it? That is a huge problem these days. And again, went in there, installed some communication systems to open things up where they were clearly communicating and working well together and collaboratively across those teams, and it made a huge difference, huge impact. But these are all of the areas where we really need to watch out for this and to be really careful about this. So what we want to really do is to focus on creating a culture where we communicate clearly, where we are responsible for all communication, where we develop strong listening skills and we really listen to people. And we're showing value, appreciation for others, and we're checking our perceptions. We want to make sure that we are asking questions. Now, don't pull up the next slide yet, because I want to give a little bit of an explanation about what to do with it before it comes up. So the next slide that's going to come up, when you see it, I want you to read something that's on it. There's something written on it, and I want you to actually read it out loud, not to yourself. Say it out loud, and then I'll debrief it for you. Okay, you can go ahead, Lisa. Okay, did you say opportunity is nowhere or opportunity is now here? This is kind of like the glass half full or the glass half empty. Today, we've talked about a number of things. We've talked about our 3 most costly communication mistakes, when they're most likely to occur, and what you can do about them. But this is like the glass half full or half empty. You could walk out of here today and say, well, that was entertaining for 45 minutes, an hour, but now I'm just going to get on with the rest of my life. In which case, opportunity is nowhere. Or you could say, those were some really good ideas. I want to try implementing them and see if I can really make a difference on my team. See if I can transform some communication and some of our relationships as well. In today's business world of having to do more, better, faster with less, communication is no longer just the soft skill we once thought. It is the most important factor and often under-recognized factor in saving time and money, preventing these delays and all the issues from the breakdowns. So communication is extremely important. I'm about to open this up for questions. And before I do, I just want to make one last mention. Here's a final thought I want to leave you with before we go into the questions. The biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has occurred. And that's a quote from George Bernard Shaw. Okay, Lisa, we can go to the questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Patty. That was great. I see some questions coming in, and if you are listening still with us today, thank you so much. Go ahead and put your question either in the Q&A or chat, and I'll make sure that Dr. Malone gets a chance to answer it. We do have one question from Nail, who's asked how to deal with interrupters, people who constantly interrupt when you're talking.
Okay, can you move the next slide to where it says questions? Thanks. Okay, people who interrupt. A lot of times people who are constantly interrupting like that are thinking something along the lines of, no one's listening to me, so I'm going to make sure they do. I'm just going to keep bursting in on this. One thing you can do is talk to them privately. I would not do this in front of other people. They might actually not consciously be aware that they're doing that. And you could say something to them. Again, what you want to be careful about is not to make it sound accusatory or like you're blaming them. You could form it as more of a question. You can state how you feel, but you can take responsibility for your feelings. You could say something like, instead of saying, you keep interrupting me, I feel disrespected when I feel like I'm being interrupted. And sometimes I feel like I am being interrupted. And I was just wondering, is there something going on? Do we need to talk about something? And just kind of put the ball in their court and let them respond. See how they react to that. Honestly, you'd be surprised. A lot of times people are completely oblivious. They're like, what? I had no idea that I was doing that. But again, they're probably doing that because they feel like that's the only way they're going to get attention. But they do need to have a discussion about it, because otherwise it will continue. They're not going to figure it out on their own. And think of it like this. You're actually doing them a service, especially if they don't know. That's only going to help improve their communication and their relationships with other people.
You know, something you said, Dr. Malone, was really important for this question specifically. But you said two things. Early on in the training, you talked about how people, they're just not listening. So if someone is going to be a frequent interrupter, it's probably because they're not listening to what someone is saying. So
Yes.
Their brain is already so far ahead in what
Yes.
they think is going to happen. And the other thing is that we need to take responsibility for both sides of the communication, whether we're the person giving the information or receiving it. So if we find ourselves in a situation where there's a lot of interruptions, how would we take control of that situation? You mentioned it, to confront them, take them aside, confront them, or talk to them about it. But in the flow, if you're in a setting where someone's interrupting and you know that you need to take control, is there one thing or one question that you can do to get them to focus on you and what you're talking about?
Yeah, I would simply say, if they've done it a couple of times, I would simply say, are there a few questions that you need to ask? I've got a lot of material to cover and I want to make sure that I'm addressing what you're concerned about or what your questions are, but I'm kind of losing my flow, my train of thought here. So what questions do you have? And then give them the floor and let them ask a few questions.
Great. Very good. Okay. I have one that came in from email. Let me just open that up. How do you fix communication issues across teams where people aren't communicating at all, or they're giving minimal information? Like, how do you communicate with someone who's almost silent?
Yeah, a good thing to do with that is to develop some kind of a cross-functional team, or at least open up, have like a liaison from each team member that can meet, like maybe once a month or even once a quarter, to discuss, to let each other know what the teams are doing. In fact, I did something like that with one of the companies that I was training not too long ago, because they had that exact issue. In fact, a number of companies have had that issue. It's the best thing to do is to get them so they're all in alignment with the overall company vision. What happens is they forget about that. They forget that they're all equally important, and they all tend to put their priorities first, which is normal because that's their team, that's their group, and that's what they're responsible for. But if you could get one representative from each of those teams and open up the communication through them across all of those teams, that can make a huge impact in terms of keeping each other informed about what changes or what the teams are doing, and to see what questions there may be, or to discuss priorities, to see if there's any conflicting priorities across teams that they can work out together. So it can be a cooperative effort.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Vin has a comment. When you talked about giving praise or recognition, the statement here is that sometimes giving too much praise or frequent recognition to people can cause the spoiled kid syndrome. So how do you make sure that that praise or recognition is appropriately balanced with reality. You're not just trying to get favor with someone, that you mean it, when you say it.
Yeah. Well, that's actually the best guideline. Say it when you mean it. When something jumps out at you and it's truly authentic and genuine, if it's not, that doesn't work because they know it and it comes across like what you just said, like fake praise, or like maybe I'm trying to make brownie points or something like that. It's not realistic. And also, if it's very generic, great job yesterday, that doesn't mean anything either. I would get real specific with it.
Mm.
Like that customer who came in here screaming this morning, you did an amazing job of calming them down and taking care of their concern. They were a happy camper when they left. And if we all paid more attention to doing what she did, that would be great for all of us. Something along those lines. And if you're really doing it when something really jumps out at you and you think it's important and it's genuine, you don't really need to worry about is too much or too little, because it won't be. Because it won't be like a constant thing where you're thinking, oh, I haven't given out 10 compliments today. It doesn't have to be like that.
Right. Very good. Okay, another one that came in from email. I like this one. How do you prevent conflict from escalating?
Oh, there's a number of things you can do. And that conflict, that's what our next webinar is going to be on. We're going to specifically focus on turning destructive conflict into cooperation. But the key is you really have to nip it in the bud. Because a lot of times, unfortunately, managers and people tend to have more of a hands-off approach, like, oh, there's this conflict, we'll just let them work it out, this personality conflict. But what happens is they start getting people to take sides, and other people don't want to be around them. They don't even want to come to work. It really has a negative impact on a lot of people. So it's got to be nipped in the bud. They need to be talked to first, I would say individually with each of them, and then maybe bring them in together. But there's got to be a way to find out what the root cause is. And again, a lot of times that's going to go back to not listening. Somebody feels like they're not being heard, but if you can get them to listen to each other, and whoever's bringing them together, if it's an HR manager or director or whoever it might be, or a manager sitting there with them, to really listen. And that's why I say meet with each of them individually first, to really get a perspective for what's going on from their point of view, from their side, and to be empathetic and open to help create that space where that can be worked out. And it can be.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And then if there are any other questions, feel free to put them in chat or Q&A. We're going to wrap it up. I've got one more here. Someone asked, how do we get someone to really listen to you? What is the number one thing to get someone to actually open their ears and their mind and ingest what you're saying?
I would do the question asking process, where I would start asking questions to check and see where they are. And then maybe even ask them to repeat back in their own words what you just said. And again, we have to be careful with this. And you don't want to come across like that's what's your agenda in the back of your head, like, I know you're not listening and I'm going to prove it to you, because that won't help things. But if you could start asking them questions, or you might even say, and not specifically directed at them, but might even say something like, sometimes I feel like not everybody's listening to me. What do you think I should do about that? That's another possible way to approach it. Now, with things like listening and even with just communication, it is trial and error. There's not like a succinct formula. If you do this, this is going to happen, and it's going to be that way every single time. It's not, because we're all individual beings and human beings, and we're all different. So it may be a little bit of trial and error with that person to see what works. But again, a lot of times they may have no idea that you feel that way. They may have no clue that you feel like they aren't listening to them. And that could be a real eye-opener for them. And again, it's doing them a service, because then people will be more engaged in having conversations with them if they feel like they're being listened to.
Sure. And there's a little interesting story that I have when it comes to people listening. Is sometimes the communicator needs to do a better job being invested in the conversation or the information as well. I once had a employee that every time I looked at them and they were talking to me, they would look everywhere else but at me. And I kept looking around thinking, what are they looking at? And I couldn't pay attention.
Yeah.
It was so hard. So we have to take responsibility too, to be invested in the message that we're sharing and communicating with other people. I think my two cents there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, wow, Dr. Malone, we had such a great turnout on the program today, and we're just going to give you just a little kind of advanced opportunity. We're going to do a second training. Dr. Malone, tell them a little bit about the next free training that's coming up next month, and they'll get information in the email about it because they signed up for this one. But what's coming up on deck for us?
It's going to be how to deal with conflict, turning destructive conflict into cooperation. And it's got a lot of really good information in it. It's got from two sides. It's like, how do you deal with that person, especially when you're in the middle of a conflict? How do you interact with them? How do you communicate with them to make things better? As well as, what do you say to yourself? What can you shift in your own mind so you're not being so triggered by them? Because we have a tendency when we're in a conflict and our emotions, our buttons are getting pushed and we're getting emotional, we're getting upset, we're getting angry. That's actually giving them total control over us. We want to take our own control back. We want to have control over our emotions and how we're feeling about that person, about ourselves. And we also want to have coping methods so we're not going to come into work feeling like, oh my gosh, I don't want to come to work today because I'm going to have to be around that person and that person's going to start another conflict and I can't stand it. So it's, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with them? And how do you deal with yourself in terms of coping with it?
Excellent. Well done. Excellent information. Thank you again, everyone, for being on the training. And we look forward to seeing you on Dr. Malone's next training coming up shortly. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Dr. Malone at info@drpattymalone.com. Visit her website, drpattymalone.com, or check her out on Facebook. Follow her. She's sharing really good information on a regular basis, great video tips for communication, and she'll help you stay on top of communicating more effectively with your team, your employees, and it filters into every part of your life. So Clear Communication Institute, Dr. Patty Malone, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.